Western Europe, 481 AD. It is fewer than 100 years since the Roman Emperor Theodosius the Great briefly re-established the ancient imperium from Britain to the Syrian desert for the final time. In the intervening decades, the government and culture of the European landmass has been transformed to a degree that would have been unfathomable to Theodosius and the sons who inherited the empire. In Italy, the city of Rome itself and all of its treasures have been conquered by the Germanic Syrian leader Odoacer and his followers, who now rule the peninsula with the unprecedented support of the Roman Senate. To the north, in the former province of Gaul, the Visigoths control both its southern regions and the lands of Iberia across the Pyrenees, laying claim to a monumental domain. North of the Visigoths, the Burgundians have established their kingdom with its own evolving culture, while to the northeast of them again, straddling the banks of the Rhine, lies the domain of the Alemanni, the tribe that for centuries was a thorn in the side of the now defunct Roman administration. 3 states line the North Channel coast. That of the Bretons and Gallo-Romans of Armorica in the far west, the Romano-Gallic domain of the general Syagrius, and then east of that, the kingdoms of the Franks. The Franks have a long history in the area known then as Gallia Belgica. As old Roman allies, they were stalwart defenders of the Rhine frontier. Their leaders and generals were sometimes more powerful than emperors in recent decades. As far back as 360 AD, the last pagan emperor Julian ascended to the purple in the Frankish manner, carried on a shield by his devoted troops. In the decades following, Franks like Ricimer and his nephew Arbogast rose to the highest echelons of the Roman military and government. The Franks were thus in an advantageous position under their 5th century leaders, Claudio, Merovesh and Childeric, to carve a domain for themselves in the north of Gaul and Germania Inferior. This territory waxed and waned in size as the Frankish custom of dividing inheritance among each son equally meant that no leader was able to build upon the full achievements and resources gathered by his predecessors. The Frankish tribes themselves had even split into 2 separate bodies, the Ripuarian and Salian Franks. Of all the new kingdoms in the formerly united province of Gaul, the Franks had thus become perhaps the least promising, in that they lacked the wealth of the southern Mediterranean areas of the Burgundians and Visigoths, and they also seemingly lacked the established urban resources and heritage of Syagrius. So it was that in the early 480s, a new leader, Clovis of the Salian Franks, still in his teenage years, inherited a tiny domain around the village of Tournai. Reputedly a descendant of Claudio, whose land stretched as far south as the Somme River. When Clovis came to power after the death of his father, he commanded just 500 men. Clovis's rise from obscurity in an age of turmoil and bewilderment was based on 3 principles: stability for those who came under his domain, discipline within his armed ranks, and a dedication to the absolute merciless elimination of anyone who could present a threat to his rule. His commitment to terminating his own kin was so complete that toward the end of his life, the chronicler Gregory of Tours records that Clovis lamented having to spend his old age alone, as a stranger among strangers, and having no family by his side. In true despotic style, Gregory suspected that Clovis's cry of anguish was in fact a ruse to encourage any remaining relatives to naively step forward and thus face instant execution. The morality of this fratricidal policy aside, within a half a decade of his inheriting a royal title, Clovis was ready to take on one of the foremost powers of the post-Roman West. This was Syagrius, the ruler of the remaining Roman enclave in Gaul, first conquered by Julius Caesar more than 5 centuries previously. Clovis had not yet disposed of every one of his extended family, and this campaign was mounted in tandem with his relative, Ragnachar. Another Frankish chieftain, Chararic, accepted Clovis's request for support at the outset of the conflict, but he did his best to remain outside the fighting, waiting to see who would gain the upper hand. From Gregory's account, Syagrius welcomed the chance to grapple with the Franks. His realm, which he had inherited from his father, Aegidius, included the major population centers of Lutetia, modern Paris, Novidunum, Soissons, and Aurelianum, modern Orléans. Aegidius had served under 2 famous generals, Aetius and Majorian, and been appointed Magister Militum of Gaul. As the rest of the Western Empire had fallen to Germanic tribes, this Kingdom of Soissons, as it became known, endured for almost 30 years, seeing off the challenge of the Visigoths at the Battle of Orléans in 463. With the still potent Roman apparatus of northern Gaul at his disposal, and decades in which to consolidate his power and forces, Syagrius felt confident that when his army met young Clovis and his Franks, he would emerge the victor. Yet it was Syagrius whose host broke that day, and he fled the field, making his way as far south as Toulouse, where he sought refuge with the king of the Visigoths, Alaric II. Clovis's campaign did not stop with a single battle. However, instead of returning to his domain with booty, the Frankish king made it clear that his goal was conquest, not mere raiding or fleeting battlefield heroics. After pillaging the religious houses of the Soissons state, for Clovis remained a pagan, he took the fortress of Verdun after a short siege, and then overcame the resistance of Paris after a much more protracted affair. Clovis, still in his early to mid-20s, was now operating at a level far above that of a petty warlord in command of a few hundred men. The natural defenses of the Ile de Paris in the middle of the Seine River would have been formidable. It's impossible to tell whether the city fell through the military expertise of Clovis, incorporating siege equipment, pontoon engineering, and amphibious warfare, or whether some treachery was involved. Or perhaps Clovis simply starved the inhabitants over the course of a number of years until their supplies were exhausted. But there is no doubt that any one of those 3 possibilities would have required some skill or endurance on the part of the general in command. Clovis next set himself the task of endearing himself, or at least his rule, to the majority Gallo-Romans of the area. After making a settlement with the church authorities following his pillage during the war, he also took a Christian wife and gave employment to remaining units of Syagrius's forces. He now firmly planted his roots in north-central Gaul. He inherited the considerable Roman weapon and armor-making facilities in the area. The old border forts on the Rhine were now under his control. But Clovis rejected complacency. His growing reputation was displayed in the wake of these victories when Alaric returned Syagrius to him after the Frank demanded custody of his defeated enemy. Interestingly, though Syagrius was put to death, possible members of his family were recorded operating within the Frankish government a century later. Another indicator of how Clovis was able to walk the line between nourishing an intimidating reputation but also incorporating members of defeated regimes into his own government, just as the Romans had done so successfully for centuries. The Burgundians were not immune to this new force in northern Gaul, for Clovis had doubled the size of the Frankish domain with his capture of Soissons. After a power struggle within the Burgundian royal family, Clovis demanded the hand of one of their princesses, Clothilde. Unsurprisingly, her uncle Gundobad felt it unwise to refuse him. Gundobad, who had his seat of power in Vienne, had in fact slain Clotilde's father Chilperic II, ruler of Lyon, and her mother Caratene. To give a warrior like Clovis blood ties to the Burgundian royal family must have gone against his instincts, but with the choice of marriage or war, Gundobad chose what seemed to be the safer option. The use of the Gallo-Roman Aurelianus to make the first contact on Clovis's behalf to Clothilde in person was another demonstration of Clovis's embrace of the imperial apparatus and culture within his realms. Like Clothilde, Aurelianus would also encourage Clovis to embrace Catholicism over the pagan and Arian alternatives. Clovis spent the next years consolidating his power and incorporating the new elements under his rule. He was careful throughout his reign never to overextend operations and only embarked on large-scale campaigns after 5 or 10-year stabilization periods. During the time after his war with Syagrius, his marriage with Clothilde flourished, and after losing their first child shortly after birth, they would eventually have 4 surviving children. Clothilde insisted on having each baptized into her Catholic faith, but her efforts to win Clovis over from his paganism were, for the moment, in vain. Clothilde's faith was also unusual amongst the Germanic tribes, the majority of whom had adopted Arian Christianity. Clovis's reach then extended further. He secured a very important coup by marrying his sister Odofleda to Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, who had recently been crowned king of Italy after disposing Odoacer in the name of the Emperor Zeno. Thus, as the mid-490s approached, Clovis's position looked very secure indeed. So when this peace was shattered by conflict with the Alemanni, however, it is highly likely that Clovis was not disturbed by the onset of a new major war. The Alemanni had been present in Western Europe since the time of Caracalla and were still occupying land on either side of the Rhine. This tribe, which translates to all men or all peoples, had invaded the Roman Empire as far back as the middle of the 3rd century, and their forces had reached the lands of Italy itself before the Emperor Aurelian drove them out in 271. This did not halt their ambitions, and before the 3rd century was finished, they were once again invading Gaul. 3 generations later, the Emperor Julian, in the years just prior to taking the purple, ran a major campaign to expel them from northern Gaul. 100 years after that, the Alemanni were allies of Attila when he lost the Battle of Catalaunian Fields to Flavius Aetius and his confederation. As late as 457, 2 centuries after their defeat to Aurelian, one of the final emperors of the West, Majorian, defeated them at Campi Canini, near Lake Maggiore. The Alemanni, in other words, had been in close contact with the Roman world for as long as the Franks, and with the Romans now gone, they presumed that the former allies of the emperors would be fair game on which to continue their raids. Notably, these raids did not strike directly onto Clovis's territories, but instead on his kinsmen, the Ripuarian Franks, whose domain centered on their capital, Cologne. Under the Ripuarian king Sigebert the Lame, a low-level war of banditry, incursions and animal rustling with the Alemanni grew into a matter of national importance to the leaders of the tribal confederations. Eventually, in the middle of the last decade of the 5th century, 20 years after the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, the Alemanni invaded the Ripuarian Frankish lands in force. Looting, pillaging, and taking slaves in the established manner, the Alemanni leadership was hardly surprised when Sigebert appealed to his kinsmen and beseeched Clovis to aid him. Clovis's northern realms were now secure enough for him to embark on another major campaign, with nothing less than conquest as his primary objective. Assembling his vassals and allies, Clovis met with the Alemanni host at the fortress of Tolbiac, just over 50 kilometers southwest of Cologne. Tolbiac had been a considerable settlement during the Roman period, as it was a crossroads of major highways connecting Cologne with Trier by way of the Via Agrippa, as well as the southern roads to the Rhine fortresses at Zantenne, Neuss, Bonn, and Jülich. The wide flat area around Tolbiac was also surrounded by forested terrain and lakes. Clovis's force would have most likely confronted the Alemanni host as it made its way south once more along the now cracked and overgrown imperial roads, laden with spoils. There is some speculation that the Ripuarian Franks had taken large casualties in an earlier battle, possibly with Clovis present. Nevertheless, it is not in contention that Clovis and his Alemanni adversaries met in a decisive encounter in which their forces, likely numbering fewer than 10,000 on each side, were massed in a hazardous gamble for both nations. Despite the small size of Clovis's forces, little more than a single Roman legion and its auxiliaries, his ranks were at the outset of the battle organized into a coherent shape. The Franks were said to favor the bull's head V shape, with the majority of their forces being infantry accompanied by cavalry posted to the wings and in Clovis's immediate entourage. With the Franks having served for centuries in the ranks of the legions, it is likely they embraced elements of Roman military doctrine and battlefield tactics during this period. The Alemanni had a similarly long-standing history with the Roman way of war, and they were arrayed in the same manner. As the two forces came into range, the battle began with an exchange of projectiles. The tribe's weapons were similar to those of the legions. Each Frank carried a sword and dagger, along with an embossed shield used for battering and stunning opponents on the opposite line. Each man carried missile weapons, with the Frankish Engan being a near-identical descendant of the Roman pilum. These were thrown to thin out ranks, and their narrow, elongated metal points were designed to bend when embedded in a shield, thus rendering it useless to the bearer. These tips were also specially cast so as to make their removal excruciatingly painful when they struck vulnerable points, effectively disabling the victim. The Franks' final weapon was not in the Roman armory, the throwing axe. These were every bit as disruptive and injurious as the Engan, and when launched en masse, would break shields as easily as they broke faces. Germanic tribes wore irregular mail and helmets, with such valuable items being passed on from warrior to son, and so on. And as fathers and sons standing alongside each other expended their projectiles, a general advance began. Clovis's army may have had the formation and the arms, but it lacked the precision drill that had elevated the Romans above their enemies for centuries. The charge was thus more similar to a massed assault. When the battle was joined, both sides fought with fervor and fury, but the maneuverability and discipline in the face of enemy attacks made the action a sporadic affair. Close encounters were followed by limited withdrawals, those bravest finding their way to the front, and those with less physical prowess or tremulous natures being pushed to the rear. To Clovis's perturbation, the Alemanni began to gain the better part of the battle, and his Franks were in disarray, taking a beating. It is at this point that the annals record Clovis as calling out to the Christian god of his wife, Clotilda, for assistance, while promising in return to further the worship of his name. It is a moment that bears more than a passing resemblance to Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. By this time, the Frankish army was on the verge of collapse. Parts of their line were crumbling, men trampled by the relentless push of the Alemanni warriors. But whatever the truth of the story, the records are clear that after Clovis's invocation, his forces rallied. Frankish captains urged the men to stay in the fight, and a semblance of order was restored in the line. With inexplicable determination, the Franks returned from the brink. Through sheer force of arms, they hacked back at the Alemanni, unflinching at the brutality around them and the wounds they suffered. The Alemanni, for all their ferocity, buckled under the pressure and began a disorganized withdrawal. The Franks won the field, and with it the road into the heart of Alemanni lands. Clovis absorbed Alemanni territories into his own, once again doubling the size of his empire. Without question, the Battle of Tolbiac was one of the decisive battles in late antiquity, for it marked the conversion of the Franks to Christianity. This lay the foundation for the Merovingian Frankish dynasty and opened the way for Charlemagne and his deep impact on European history some centuries later. But Clovis's battles and wars were not yet finished. There was still the matter of the Visigoths in Gaul, as well as the former allies and kinsmen like Sigebert and the hesitant Chararic to eliminate before he attained supreme power. Clovis used his newfound Catholic Christianity as the pretext for the war on the Visigoths and the Thuringians, as well as his eradication of the Alemanni independence. By the time of his death in 511, his Merovingian Frankish line had garnered the lands commonly held to be the heartland of France, while at the same time, its place within the Catholic tradition of Christendom was also set in perpetuity. 1500 years later, General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French during the Second World War and founder of the Fifth French Republic, explicitly stated it was at Tolbiac that the inception of the French state began. The merging of its warrior tradition with that of the Catholicism which France would defend and crusade for a millennia. And this was no idle musing of the historically obsessed titan of 20th century France. The name Clovis lived on in its modern form, Louis, and it was taken as the monarchical appellation of no fewer than 18 French kings, with others bringing the total to arguably over 20 when one includes the likes of Louis Philippe and Louis Napoleon. More than any other battle then, France, in all its glory, can be said to have been founded on the forgotten field of Tolbiac. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.